April 8, 1943. At 27,000 feet over Caen, France, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermekin watched through the clear canopy of his FW-190A5 as bulky shapes clawed their way up toward his formation. Even behind an oxygen mask, his grin showed. At just 26, the seasoned ace studied the Americans making their first fighter appearance over occupied Europe, and couldn't resist the jab. "Our enemies have sent us flying milk bottles," he radioed to his wingman, laughing as the huge Republic P-47s struggled for height. Far below, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts from the 4th Fighter Group climbed in close formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines fighting the drag and weight of a 7-ton airframe. To German pilots raised on slim Spitfires and agile Soviet fighters, these American machines looked almost absurd. Barrel-like fuselages beneath greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed undersized, and propellers larger than anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. What Hermekin and the hunters circling above couldn't yet grasp was that they were watching the arrival of a weapon that would methodically break the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. Within 18 months, the milk bottles would stop being a joke and become a nightmare. Their battery of Browning machine guns would turn into a signature sound of fear across German skies. The arithmetic of destruction was already built into those wide wings. Thousands of rounds carried aboard, a combined torrent of fire measured in the thousands per minute. Enough concentrated force to tear an aircraft apart in seconds. That change began on that April morning when Major Donald Blay, leading the 335th Fighter Squadron, saw the German formation settling into position for an attack. A former Eagle Squadron pilot who had flown RAF Spitfires only weeks earlier, he understood what many of his men had not yet learned. In the P-47, survival meant discarding the instincts of traditional dogfighting and embracing an entirely different way to fight. The Thunderbolt itself was a break from the accepted logic of fighter design. While Germany focused on light interceptors built to climb fast and turn tightly, Republic Aviation produced something no one had seen before: a high-altitude bruiser that relied on mass, horsepower, and heavy firepower to rewrite the rules of air combat. Among the 56 American pilots scattered across the French sky that morning were men who would soon become famous, future aces whose names would weigh on Luftwaffe crews long before a shot was fired. But on April 8, 1943, they were beginners in an aircraft still proving itself, facing the most battle-hardened fighter force on Earth. The Germans had fought without pause since 1939, veterans of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. The Americans in this arena had been at war for precisely 0 days. This is the story of how industrial logic overcame tactical mastery, how numbers and capability fused into crushing superiority, and how the laughter of German pilots curdled into fear once they learned what synchronized Browning guns could do to an aircraft at 400 yards. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born from alarm in June 1940. As German fighters swept across France, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, was handed urgent requirements from the US Army Air Corps. Build a high-altitude interceptor that could meet the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli delivered instead was something far beyond the request: a machine that expanded the limits of what a fighter could be. "It will be a dinosaur," he told his team. "But it will be a dinosaur, one with good proportions." When the XP-47B prototype took to the air on May 6, 1941, It stunned nearly everyone who laid eyes on it. With an empty weight of 9,900 pounds, it was about 65% heavier than the P-43 Lancer it replaced. The huge turbo-supercharger installation, its ducts and plumbing snaking through the rear fuselage, gave the aircraft a swollen, almost pregnant silhouette. Test pilots approaching it for the first time tended to ask the same blunt question: does this thing actually fly? It did, and at altitude it flew like nothing else in the sky. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 2,000 horsepower, could hold full power at 27,000 feet, where German fighters began to choke for air. Exhaust-driven turbo-supercharging effectively delivered sea-level performance in the thin upper air, far beyond what conventional superchargers could sustain. Major Hubert "Hube" Scarr, commanding the 56th Fighter Group during training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially loathed the aircraft. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit suffered 18 pilot deaths and lost 41 airplanes in training accidents. In those months, the P-47 claimed more American lives in training than German pilots would in the early stages of combat. It could ground loop on landing, torque roll on takeoff, and dive so aggressively that pilots ran into compressibility, controls stiffening as shock waves formed along the wings. Yet those who learned to handle it found something remarkable. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, an Oklahoma farm boy who would later become one of America's leading aces with 27 victories, recalled his first flight in vivid terms. It felt, he said, like being strapped to a locomotive, power beyond anything he'd known. You didn't so much fly the Thunderbolt as point it where you wanted it to go. The first fights of April and May 1943 seemed to validate every German assumption. The P-47 couldn't outturn the FW-190, couldn't outclimb the Bf-109, and at medium altitudes it lacked the quick, delicate handling German pilots took for granted. Luftwaffe flyers quickly refined methods to exploit that. Strikes from below, where the heavy Thunderbolts labored, and invitations into turning contests where agility outweighed brute force. Josef Pips Priller, leading Jagdgeschwader 26, reported after his first encounter that the new American fighter was meat for the slaughter. To his men, it was a punchline. It drove like a truck, turned like a freight train, and climbed like a pregnant cow. They mocked it as a fat target pretending to be a warrior, and early numbers appeared to back up the arrogance. In the first month of operations, American groups lost 14 Thunderbolts in exchange for only 3 confirmed German kills. Even the RAF, watching from their Spitfire units, quietly hinted the Americans might want to rethink their choice of aircraft. British pilots joked that the best evasive action in a P-47 was to unbuckle and sprint around its spacious cockpit. But in those opening clashes, something was unfolding that German intelligence failed to register. The Thunderbolts that went down often did so only after soaking up punishment that should have been fatal. One aircraft returned from a May 4 mission with 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun strikes, damage that would have torn a Messerschmitt or Spitfire apart. The big radial engine, with no exposed coolant system to rupture, could absorb hits that would have ended the fight instantly for a liquid-cooled fighter. And more importantly, when a P-47 did manage to bring its guns to bear, the outcome was brutal. Its weapon battery created a concentrated zone of destruction unlike anything German pilots had faced. Unlike early war rifle-caliber guns or cannon limited by short ammunition supply, the American fighter could keep firing for more than 30 seconds, an eternity in air combat. The moment that began to reshape German opinion came on June 26, 1943, over Lazo, France. It centered on 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron, and an encounter that would echo through both air forces. Johnson was returning from escort duty as part of a formation of 48 P-47s when they were jumped by 16 FW-190s from 2 JG-26, led by Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of the well-known Adolf Galland. The Germans executed the textbook strike, a high-speed dive out of the sun, arriving with a crushing advantage in energy. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying near the back of the formation, was instantly caught in overlapping fire from several attackers. In the opening seconds, the damage was devastating. 20mm shells burst across the airframe. The canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid misted into the cockpit. The engine cowling was ripped away, and flames erupted behind the instrument panel. Johnson, cut in the nose and leg by fragments and bullets, tried to bail out, only to find he couldn't. A 20mm explosion in the canopy track had jammed it closed, effectively welding it shut. At 27,000 feet, he was trapped inside a dying aircraft. What followed would challenge everything pilots believed about how much punishment a fighter could endure. With the windscreen blinded by oil, an engine shaking itself apart, and controls that only responded in fits and starts, Johnson somehow steadied the aircraft and aimed it toward England. Any other fighter would have become wreckage falling out of the sky. The P-47 kept going. And then the situation tightened further. A lone FW-190, flown by an unknown pilot from 2 JG-26, spotted the cripple limping toward the channel at under 170 miles per hour. Historians have never pinned down the pilot's identity with certainty, though German reports from that day have fueled several candidates. What followed became one of the most astonishing episodes in aerial combat. The Germans slid in behind Johnson and opened fire with his 20mm cannon and two 13mm machine guns. Johnson had no real ability to maneuver. He could only crouch behind the armor plate and endure the impacts. The Thunderbolt swallowed the entire cannon load. Then the German pilot adjusted position and fired again, this time relying on machine guns alone. With the cannon ammunition gone, he pulled up alongside the shattered aircraft, staring at what looked like a flying wreck that refused to fall. Johnson could see his face clearly. Young, blonde, his confidence draining into confusion, and then into something closer to disbelief. The German slipped back once more and poured the rest of his machine gun rounds into the P-47. And still it stayed airborne. The pilot came alongside again, shook his head in open astonishment, gave a casual salute, and broke away, apparently out of ammunition. Johnson's Thunderbolt reached Manston and touched down with the engine failing as it rolled out. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after passing 200. One cannon detonation had gone off inches from Johnson's head. Another had struck the armor behind his seat. The engine had been hit directly. Control cables were partly cut. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural spine of the fuselage, had been pierced. Yet the aircraft had done the one thing that mattered most. It brought its pilot home. Johnson's survival sent a jolt through both sides. American engineers examining the ruined Thunderbolt realized they had underestimated what they'd built. German intelligence, receiving reports from two JG-26, initially rejected the claims. No aircraft should have been able to take that kind of damage. But multiple pilot accounts aligned, forcing an uncomfortable conclusion. The Thunderbolt had absorbed everything a top Luftwaffe fighter could deliver, and lived. By July 1943, American pilots began to unlock the P-47's real advantages. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, had found the answer the hard way. Don't try to outturn them. Don't try to outclimb them at low altitude. Use the weight. Use the power. Use the guns. The mass that had looked like a flaw became a tool. In a dive, almost nothing could touch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach roughly 550 miles per hour, faster than German fighters could manage even in a vertical plunge. And that speed could be traded back into altitude in a zoom climb, leaving any pursuer hanging behind with no answer. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, who would become one of the first American aces in Europe, helped refine what came to be known as boom and zoom, a method pilots sometimes nicknamed the Thunderbolt turkey shoot. Instead of entering classic turning dogfights, P-47 units climbed to around 30,000 feet, above the altitude where many German fighters could work effectively. When Luftwaffe aircraft appeared beneath them, the Thunderbolts rolled inverted and dived, accelerating to speeds that made accurate deflection fire nearly impossible for the defenders. At the bottom of the plunge, the heavy machine guns began their work, and German survivors later said it felt like flying into a solid wall of lead. The combined streams of fire created a near inescapable kill zone. Aircraft caught inside that convergence didn't simply lose a fight, they came apart in the air. The full meaning of that American firepower became clear during the dual raid of August 17, 1943, against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest strike into Germany attempted up to that point. The mission exposed the P-47's major weakness, range, even with drop tanks, while also revealing just how devastating it could be when used the right way. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, spotted a formation of Messerschmitt 110 destroyers moving into position to attack B-17s with heavy cannon and rockets. These twin-engine German fighters, heavily armed but less agile, served as specialized bomber killers for the Luftwaffe. Schilling's 4 Thunderbolts rolled over and plunged from about 28,000 feet. Unteroffizier Hinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Bf-110s who survived, later described the moment during a POW interrogation. The Americans dropped like hammers out of the sky. He claimed he opened fire from 800 meters, saw strikes land on a wing, and the P-47 barely reacted. Then the Thunderbolt answered. The aircraft ahead of them didn't go down, it disintegrated. Wings tore away from the fuselage, the tail separated, and the crew compartment shredded into fragments. In his account, a Bf-110 became nothing in roughly 2 seconds. In less than a minute, multiple German aircraft were destroyed. For Luftwaffe crews, it was an unfamiliar kind of violence. Concentrated firepower delivered in a single, overwhelming burst. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds total, amounting to nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. With convergence typically set around 300 yards, the ballistic paths of all 8 Brownings met in a space roughly 6 feet across. Anything inside that circle faced around 100 projectiles per second, each leaving the muzzle at roughly 2,900 feet per second. Even the ammunition mix spoke to American industrial depth. Where German fighters often fought with tight cannon allotments, commonly 120 to 200 rounds for a 20mm gun, Thunderbolt pilots could keep firing for more than half a minute. Their belts combined armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball in sequences meant not only to break structures, but to spark fires. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, who would finish as the top American ace in Europe with 28 victories, captured the effect in plain terms. When all 8 guns connected, he said, the enemy didn't merely crash, it detonated. He recalled seeing a Bf-109 effectively split apart, tail falling away from the nose and wings, with the pilot never realizing what had happened. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was confronting another grim fact about the Thunderbolt. The higher it fought, the better it became, while German fighters weakened. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp held rated power up to about 30,000 feet. German aircraft, relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers, saw their performance fall off sharply above roughly 25,000. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories, met that reality on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, he found his FW-190A6 heavy and sluggish in the thin air. The BMW 801, formidable lower down, was now starved for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. When the 56th Fighter Group's P-47s came down from 32,000 feet, Philip's formation had no room to maneuver. In that thin air, the German fighters were effectively helpless targets. Robert Johnson, now hardened by combat and moving toward ace status, was cruising at 31,000 feet when he spotted Philip's unmistakable FW-190, marked by its distinctive nose art. Johnson's report afterward was matter of fact. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Hits observed along the length of the fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute seen. Philip's loss sent a jolt through the Luftwaffe. If one of their elite, someone who had lived through more than 500 combat missions across both eastern and western fronts, could not survive an engagement with Thunderbolts, what hope did an average pilot have? The German High Command ordered an immediate examination of the P-47's true capabilities. The findings, delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943, offered no comfort. The Thunderbolt's service ceiling was reported above 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reliably reach. Its dive speed pushed toward the limits of the sound barrier. Its protection was substantial. A 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, a half-inch bullet-resistant windscreen, and armoured plates around the engine to deflect fire. Most alarming of all was its toughness. The airframe could absorb damage that would destroy multiple conventional fighters and still make it back to base. Then, in January 1944, a new version began arriving in England, one that finished the P-47's evolution from object of ridicule to genuine terror. The P-47 D-22 carried a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with broad paddle blades, 13 feet in diameter, biting into the air like enormous oars. The improvement in climb performance was immediate. Earlier Thunderbolts had struggled upward at roughly 2,200 feet per minute at sea level. The paddle blade aircraft could reach about 3,000 feet per minute, matching and often surpassing German fighters across much of the altitude band. Acceleration improved as well, letting the P-47 build energy faster even in level flight. Hauptmann Heinz Knocke of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran of more than 200 combat sorties, met the newer variants in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. In his diary, he noted, in essence, that the fat American fighters had learned to climb. His unit attacked expecting the familiar edge, only to watch the P-47s turn into them and climb with them. When the Germans tried to break away, the Thunderbolts followed them up toward 30,000 feet. A pilot named Schmitt, he wrote, was caught and shattered, nothing left but smoke and scattered fragments. These were no longer the same machines they had laughed at the year before. The paddle blade propeller did more than reshape performance. It altered the Thunderbolt's voice. The blade's tips approached supersonic speeds, producing a heavy, hammering roar that carried for miles. German troops on the ground reported they could recognize P-47s by sound alone, a deep, threatening rumble that warned of death from above. They even gave it a name, Donnerschlag, a thunderclap. By March 1944, Thunderbolts equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers far deeper into Germany. Standard loads included 2 108-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, stretching operational range to more than 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade propeller preserving strong performance even while carrying that extra weight, P-47s could drop their tanks and fight on equal terms immediately afterward. The Luftwaffe's answer was to focus on the bombers themselves, hoping that enough losses might still break the American daylight offensive. But that approach meant forcing a path through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal gamble. German pilots began to grant the big American fighters a reluctant respect that edged into fear. Major Gunther Rahl, among Germany's leading aces with 275 victories, most of them on the Eastern Front, survived an engagement with P-47s on March 6, 1944, and came away badly wounded. In a post-war interview, he remembered seeing them high above, heavy silhouettes cut against the sun. Someone joked, "Here come the flying pigs." No one was laughing half a minute later. They dropped on the Germans like an avalanche, faster than anyone could respond. On the first pass, 3 fighters simply vanished, converted into flaming debris. And their guns, Rahl recalled, didn't speak in short bursts the way German weapons often did. The Thunderbolts poured continuous streams of fire. To be caught in that stream was to die instantly. Those escort missions revealed another advantage: endurance. German fighters often flew at aggressive power settings that burned fuel quickly, while the American radial engines could cruise efficiently at high altitude. Thunderbolts could stay with the bombers for hours, cycling top cover while still retaining enough fuel to fight and return home. As more P-51 Mustangs arrived in the spring of 1944 to take over the longest-range escort work, P-47 groups shifted more and more toward ground attack, a role that would turn them into some of the most feared aircraft in the German order of battle. That shift accelerated in April 1944 as the Allies prepared to invade France. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved just as lethal against targets on the ground. Standard armor-piercing incendiary rounds could punch through the thinner top armor of many German vehicles, and the sheer volume of fire could erase soft targets in seconds. A 2-second burst could drive roughly 160 half-inch bullets into an area about the size of a truck. But it was the addition of bombs and rockets that turned the P-47 into a true multi-role brute. The D-25 variant, could haul 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage, an ordnance load comparable to early war medium bombers. Later versions added zero-length rocket rails for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each with destructive power likened to a 105mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during Normandy, experienced these attacks at close range. The Thunderbolts came in low. So low, he said, you could see the pilots' faces. The sound alone was unnerving. Engines bellowing, rockets shrieking, then the hard pounding hammer of the machine guns. In his description, a column of trucks simply stopped existing. 20 vehicles became burning wrecks in a single pass. The psychological toll was severe. The men called them jarbos, fighter bombers. But von Luck described something worse than the label suggested: flying artillery with sniper-like accuracy. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe learned just how decisively the balance had shifted. More than 500 P-47s provided air cover for the landings, forming a dense protective canopy over the beaches. German fighters trying to reach the invasion zone were cut down. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader 21, one of only 3 German pilots who reached the beaches that day, reported that the sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet. His unit tried to punch through at dawn. 12 fighters launched, and he was the only one who came back. The P-47s were waiting at every layer of the sky. There was no climbing over them, no diving under them. Their guns, he said, turned fighters into aluminum rain. In the weeks after D-Day, Thunderbolts worked systematically to destroy German movement in daylight, and the numbers that followed were staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts reported staggering destruction. 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, and 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles knocked out. The Wehrmacht was increasingly forced to move after dark, a constraint that crippled its ability to react quickly to Allied advances. German forces tried every countermeasure available: thicker armor on vehicles, more anti-aircraft guns, improved camouflage and concealment. None of it changed the outcome. The P-47's blend of speed, protection, and firepower made it brutally hard to stop. Even the dreaded 88mm flak guns struggled to track fast fighters attacking at low level. And while the Thunderbolt was tearing up targets across Europe, it was also proving itself in the Pacific. The 348th Fighter Group, flying from New Guinea, found that the aircraft's strengths fit the Pacific War perfectly: long distances, punishing weather, and rough operating conditions. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th, shaped tactics specifically for that theatre. On October 11, 1943, he led 4 P-47s against about 40 Japanese aircraft over WWII, personally shooting down 6 in a single mission, an action that earned him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, used to nimble but relatively fragile American fighters, were not prepared for the Thunderbolt's combination of durability and overwhelming firepower. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who met P-47s over New Guinea, later wrote that they called them monsters. In his account, 20mm cannon shells that could destroy a P-40 with a handful of hits seemed to do almost nothing to a Thunderbolt. He claimed he fired dozens of rounds into one and watched it keep flying. And when the P-47 answered, the return fire came in heavy streams that tore aircraft apart. The P-47N, designed specifically with the Pacific in mind, expanded that advantage further. With increased fuel capacity and wet wings holding 93 gallons each, its range stretched to roughly 2,350 miles. It would go on to escort B-29s toward Japan, proof that the short-ranged fighter of 1943 had evolved into a true long-range weapon. Perhaps the clearest validation of the P-47's progression came in its clashes with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, capable of about 540 miles per hour, should have been beyond the reach of propeller-driven aircraft. But Thunderbolt pilots learned there were two moments when jets could be caught: during takeoff and landing, when they were most exposed, and in steep, high-speed dives from altitude. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to bring down an Me-262 in a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt accelerated to speeds near 500 miles per hour, enough to close on the jet even in level flight. The German pilot, relying on superior speed, never saw the attacker until the P-47 opened fire at roughly 400 yards. Meyer later recorded that the enemy aircraft broke apart under the impact, large sections, including both engines, separating from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape. He noted that concentrated .50 caliber fire was more effective against jets than expected. By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were being fielded specifically to confront jets and V-1 flying bombs. With water methanol injection lifting output to roughly 2,800 horsepower and aerodynamic refinements, these late-model Thunderbolts could reach about 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet. Fast enough to intercept even jets under certain conditions. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron, equipped with P-47s, shot down 2 Me-262s in March 1945. His assessment emphasized lethality over pure speed. The jets were faster, but they couldn't turn well and they couldn't take punishment. One solid burst from the Thunderbolt's battery, he said, and they came apart as if made of paper. Jets had to slow down to attack bombers. Those were the moments when the P-47 could strike. The final proof of American industrial mass arrived during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate bid to cripple Allied air power on January 1, 1945. Nearly 900 German fighters, including many of their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks against Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, base of the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the assault initially achieved its aim. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground, along with several other aircraft. A captured German pilot was brought to the command post, pointed at the burning line and sneered, "What do you think of that?" Major George Bostwick's reply became famous across the 9th Air Force. He gestured toward the flight line, where ground crews were already dragging wrecks aside and clearing hard stands for replacements. "By tomorrow," he said, "we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The smirk vanished. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47D-40s filled the dispersal areas, flown in from depots in England. In Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots. many of them instructors and squadron leaders who could not be replaced. Those losses were permanent. The Americans lost 134 aircraft across the attacked airfields and replaced them all within a week. The arithmetic pointed in one direction, and both sides could read it. Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter type. At peak output, the Farmingdale plant on Long Island turned out 1 Thunderbolt per hour, day and night. The Evansville factory in Indiana, raised on what had been open farmland in 1942, was producing about 500 aircraft a month by 1944. Each P-47D demanded roughly 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of wiring, about 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone contained around 2,400 separate components, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. And yet the workforce delivered. American laborers, many of them women who had never been near an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these machines with a level of precision that met and often exceeded peacetime standards. Ammunition production matched the same scale. A single P-47 sortie consumed 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and hundreds of Thunderbolts were flying every day. By mid-1944, monthly expenditure topped 10 million rounds. Plants like the Lake City Arsenal in Missouri were turning out as many as 30 million rounds a month. Each cartridge was built to microscopic tolerances, on the order of 10,000ths of an inch, so it would feed reliably through synchronized gun systems at high rates of fire. Fuel demands were just as immense. A Thunderbolt could burn around 100 gallons per hour in routine flight, and as much as 300 gallons per hour in combat with water injection. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone was consuming more than 25 million gallons of aviation fuel each month, every drop hauled across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of mass production. But the most decisive output wasn't metal or ammunition. It was pilots. By 1944, the United States was graduating roughly 30,000 pilots a year from advanced training, more than Germany would train over the entire course of the war. A P-47 pilot typically entered combat with at least 400 hours of flight time, including around 100 hours in advanced fighters. By contrast, German pilots were reaching the front with under 100 hours total by the war's end. The difference showed up in the air. American pilots arrived in Europe already drilled in formation flying, instrument navigation, gunnery, and tactics. They trained against captured German aircraft and studied the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. They knew their own machines in detail, supported by technical manuals and system training that many German pilots simply never received. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England in September 1944, reflected that advantage. He had 420 hours in his logbook, including 75 in the P-47. He had fired on towed targets, practiced deflection shooting, and reviewed gun camera film from real combat. By his first mission, he said, he already knew what to do, and he believed the German pilot he faced couldn't have had even half that experience. It wasn't even close to an equal contest. In March 1945, Josef Pips Priller, the same pilot who had ridiculed the P-47 as a pregnant cow 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials desperate for anything that might lift morale. What he said was judged too bleak to publish. His words captured just how completely German attitudes had reversed. "The Thunderbolt," he said, "is the finest fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is beyond anything we've faced. Guns that don't jam, don't overheat, and don't run dry in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and still fights like a fighter when it has to." But for Priller, the aircraft was only part of the story. What truly crushed Germany, he argued, was what the Thunderbolt represented: the scale of American production and logistics. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, and it's gone forever. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. Against that, he said, Germany had only courage, and courage without resources was simply defeat postponed. "We laughed at them in 1943, he concluded. "We're not laughing now. When you hear those guns, you know death has come." That sound, he claimed, followed them everywhere. Mechanical, precise, relentless. And to him, it embodied the American method. Not superior daring, not smarter tactics, but crushing material force. "They didn't beat us with better tactics or braver pilots," he said. "They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead." By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely as a name on paper. Fuel shortages pinned most aircraft to the ground. Veteran pilots were dead, missing, or captured. Airfields were broken and cratered. Yet even if Germany had possessed aircraft and fuel, its pilots still faced an unsolvable equation. Any attack meant running into P-47 formations that controlled every band of altitude from the deck to 40,000 feet. Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew exactly one combat mission before the war ended. His first and final meeting with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds. He saw 4 Thunderbolts diving in perfect formation. He tried to turn away, but they were already too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. His aircraft, he said, jolted like it was being struck by sledgehammers. The engine detonated, a wing tore loose, and he barely escaped. Hanging under his parachute, he watched them erase his entire staff. 6 fighters destroyed in less than a minute. The sky, he remembered, filled with burning aluminium and falling bodies. The psychological collapse was total. German Air Force medical officers described what they called Jabo fever, physical symptoms of stress that appeared the moment Thunderbolts were reported nearby. Men who had once faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without hesitation became sick before missions against P-47s. On the ground, the heavy thunder of approaching Thunderbolts triggered instant panic, because troops understood what it meant. The only chance of survival was to dive for cover immediately. And the final figures from P-47 operations were almost beyond belief. In Europe, 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat. 3,315 destroyed on the ground. 86,000 railway cars wrecked. 9,000 locomotives destroyed. 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles eliminated. 68,000 trucks destroyed. And 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles wiped out. In the Pacific, 697 Japanese aircraft downed in the air. 150 destroyed on the ground. 1,500 vehicles destroyed, 150 locomotives destroyed, along with uncounted barges, ships, and installations. The 9th Air Force alone, largely equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. Thunderbolt units achieved a 4.6-to-1 aerial kill ratio, while also suffering the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter bomber. But behind those statistics was a brutal human toll. The Luftwaffe lost an estimated 28,000 pilots killed in combat against the Western Allies, many of them cut down by the concentrated streams of American heavy machine gun fire. Each pilot lost represented years of training and experience that Germany simply could not replace. By the end of the war, the average German fighter pilot carried less than 30 hours of combat time. The average P-47 pilot had more than 200. At the Luftwaffe interrogation center at Oberursel, German intelligence debriefed captured Allied airmen and compiled assessments of enemy aircraft. Records seized in 1945 revealed how German judgment of the P-47 evolved and how completely it flipped over time. April 1943. A large, unmaneuverable fighter, inferior to German types in most performance categories except dive speed. Machine gun armament judged inadequate against cannon-armed opponents. Assessment: minimal threat. December 1943. Outstanding high-altitude capability. Extraordinary structural toughness. Firepower becoming a serious concern. Allied pilots adopting better tactics. Assessment: major threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Dominant fighter bomber. Superior to all German types above 20,000 feet. Firepower devastating against air and ground targets. Structural strength makes it extremely difficult to shoot down. Assessment: critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Best fighter bomber of the war. A combination of durability, performance, and firepower without equal. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment: direct engagement effectively unsurvivable. In 1985, at a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, former enemies met in peace. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, who had once led the Luftwaffe's fighter arm, was asked about the P-47. His answer, captured on video, summed up the full shift in perspective. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, he said. "We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. We thought the Americans didn't understand air combat. We said they built a bomber and called it a fighter. But we were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans weren't trying to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around production, firepower, and survivability." Galland said the Americans understood attrition. In that kind of war, the aircraft that could absorb punishment and still deliver crushing firepower would win. They were right, he admitted. The first time he flew a captured P-47 after the war, the logic became obvious to him. The power was astonishing. It climbed as if it were being pulled upward. The cockpit felt spacious and comfortable. Visibility was excellent. Controls were precise. It was a pilot's airplane, wrapped in armor. But what impressed him most was the scale behind it. America, he noted, built more than 15,000 of these complex machines while fighting across 2 oceans. Each one required an engine more intricate than anything Germany produced. Yet the United States built them faster than Germany could produce simpler fighters. "That's when I knew we never had a chance," he said. And he remembered the guns, their sound. They called it Roosevelt's piano. Once you heard that noise, he said, you never forgot it. Many of his friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't merely defeat the Luftwaffe, it broke it. The Thunderbolt's design embodied American industrial thinking, brute force engineering supported by enormous resources. Everything was built heavier, stronger, and more powerful than it needed to be. Overbuilt, overpowered, and deliberately redundant. Its wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, roughly 3 times the aircraft's loaded weight. Its engine mount was rated to withstand 12 G forces. The control cables were doubled across the aircraft, supported by automatic backup systems. Even the ammunition feed was engineered on a scale that impressed observers. 8 separate ammunition boxes, each loaded with 425 rounds, fed through electric boost motors designed to prevent jams during high G maneuvers. The guns were electrically heated to keep them from freezing at altitude. Each weapon had its own charging system, and each could be synchronized individually. Convergence could be set anywhere from 150 to 400 yards, letting pilots tailor the pattern to the range they preferred. Even after the war, some German veterans insisted the P-47 triumphed through quantity rather than quality, arguing German fighters were technically better, but smothered by numbers. The combat record points elsewhere. When numbers were even, Thunderbolts repeatedly came out on top. The heavy machine gun armament, often dismissed as inferior to cannon, proved more effective in real fighting. Gun camera analysis showed why. Cannon rounds, though more powerful per hit, demanded very precise aim and came with limited ammunition, often only 120 to 200 rounds total. The P-47's battery instead created a dense cloud of bullets that produced hits even with imperfect tracking. At typical combat distances, a 2-second burst could drive at least 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, more than enough to ensure a kill. And the ammunition itself carried an edge. American .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds used a delayed action fuse designed to penetrate before igniting. The incendiary compound burned at roughly 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to set aluminum structure alight. German 20mm shells were heavier, but they often detonated on surface contact, dramatic, sometimes spectacular, yet not always as deeply destructive as penetration-first ignition. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever produced in mass numbers. Its empty weight, around 10,000 pounds, was greater than the loaded weight of some twin-engine fighters. Its engine output surpassed what entire bomber formations had delivered in the previous war. Its guns concentrated more firepower than a squad of infantry. And still it was built in the thousands, flown by young men barely out of high school, maintained in frontline conditions by mechanics who learned quickly under pressure. The shift in German perception from ridicule to fear took less than 2 years. In that span, the flying milk bottle became the most dreaded aircraft many Luftwaffe veterans ever faced. Men who had met Spitfires, Hurricanes and Soviet Yaks without hesitation spoke of the P-47 in lowered voices decades afterward. And at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters. The placard lists figures and honors, But the real message is carried by a small case of spent .50 caliber shells and a strip of gun camera film showing an FW-190 breaking apart under sustained fire. Beneath it is a quotation attributed to an unnamed German pilot, taken from a 1945 interrogation report. They laughed the first time they saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. They stopped laughing when they understood those things didn't matter. The Thunderbolt didn't need to turn or climb. It only had to point its guns, and the target ceased to exist. The laughter ended alongside their comrades. The P-47 entered the war as a punchline and finished it as an instrument of destruction. Between those 2 points, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns helped rewrite the logic of air combat and buried the Luftwaffe beneath an unrelenting storm of lead. In April 1943, German pilots laughed at the awkward American fighter. By May 1945, there were no pilots left to laugh. The thunder had spoken, and the sky belonged to America.